We're in Colorado and it looks like a beautiful day for a hike. I like to tease my friends from Texas that Colorado is actually the largest state in the United States, or it would be if you ironed it flat. We've got a lot of the mountains, over 700 mountains higher than 13,000 feet. I like to climb these mountains on a day like this. And as I climb the mountains, I've actually learned a lot about the subject of prayer. We're going to be delving into that subject over the next few weeks together. Mountain hikes involve ecstatic moments, sometimes long slogs, and sometimes difficult times. And as I've talked to people and had my own prayer experiences, I've realized that prayer is a little bit like that as well. When I first started this book, I interviewed people about their prayer lives. Almost everybody prays. 90% of people pray on a regular basis, surveys say. And I started listening to people's prayers. People sometimes get confused. A lot of the prayers I hear in church are informing God of something that God may not know, or trying to talk God into doing something that God may not want to do. And I realized that there's got to be something more to prayer than that. So I went to the experts, I interviewed a lot of people, and I came up with a new approach to prayer that I hope it helps encourage your prayer life. Often prayer is lumped under a phrase like spiritual discipline, and I think that may be a little bit misleading, because for me it's not so much a discipline as a privilege. It's something that we are privileged to do, to have a companionship with the God of the universe. It's not something that we do just to make God like us, some hoop we have to jump through to be a good Christian. It's something that's good for us in every way. I see some clouds moving in, so I probably better get this hike underway. Let's get started on this journey together. Well, it's a beautiful day here in Colorado, close to freezing cold, and it's just been pouring down rain. I'm at about 11,280 feet, according to the altimeter on my watch, right at timberline. Still a few trees around, but just ahead of me is a big pile of rocks. This is the Rocky Mountains, after all. And the reason I'm here is because a lot of the things I have learned about prayer, I learned right here on mountains just like this. There are 54 mountains over 14,000 feet in Colorado, and I've been climbing them. I've climbed number 51 as of last weekend. It gives a lot of time to think about prayer and to think about God. I remember one time I was climbing a beautiful mountain we have out here called Uncompahgre. You start early in the morning, as in 4 o'clock in the morning early, long before the sun's up. Wear a headlamp. The first few miles on the trail are nice and soft and gentle. Usually there's a running stream making nice gurgling noises, and the ground is soft. And then gradually you can kind of see the sun rise. But it doesn't appear to rise. It actually starts high on the mountains because you're usually in a bowl, and it comes down. So it's actually working its way down. On that particular hike on Uncompahgre, just as the sun was coming out, it was a little bit above us. My wife and I saw a flash of color, about 40 bright spots of blue, like fireworks. We didn't know what it was. And then we realized it was a flock of mountain bluebirds. They had just caught the sun. And we realized that we were the only people in the world who had seen that sight at that time. When the sun comes up, you see that the ground is carpeted with wildflowers. You go through these beautiful alpine meadows, and then the hard work begins. You got to start hauling, climbing up the ridge of these steep mountains. I remember when we reached the ridge at Uncompahgre, we looked back down from where we had come, and we realized that we were going to make it. We were going to make the summit. So we stopped and took a break. We drank some water. We had some carrots and trail mix and, okay, probably a Snickers bar or two. And as we were sitting there, I looked down, way in the valley, and I saw it looked like a little red dot and a little blue dot. I couldn't tell, is it alive? Is it an animal? Is it a rock? And I realized they're moving. It must be alive. And I suddenly knew these are people. These are hikers. They started way too late in the day, probably 3 hours after we did, running in danger of storms. And as I sat there watching those tiny little dots, I realized just 3 hours before we were those dots. It gave me a different perspective, what I call the God's eye view. There's a scene at the end of Job where Job, who has more reason to complain about the way the world runs than anybody I know, actually had an interview with God himself. God showed up and God gave a speech, which is the longest single speech given by God in the entire Bible. And God basically gave Job a lesson of nature. He said, Job, let me tell you, where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Can you control a lightning bolt? Can you control a crocodile? Can you control wild horses? And he gave him a nature lesson. And at the end of it, Job just hung his head and said, I repent in dust and ashes. I didn't know what I was talking about. I had no idea. That's a little bit of how I felt when I was on the ridge at Uncompahgre looking down. Because so often in my prayers, I'm very me-centered. I'm concerned about, why doesn't God care about my life? And when I had that view of me as a tiny little dot way down in the valley, I realized that I'm just a dot. And that God is this indescribable, infinite creator of all that is, that has the entire universe to worry about. It gave me a different perspective. I realized that I needed to realign how I look at the world. When I go through daily life, when I turn on the television, when I listen to the radio, I hear messages that what counts is how beautiful you are and how successful you are, how much money you make. Jesus gives us a very different message. He says what matters really is whether you care for the poor. He says those who mourn are blessed, those who persecuted are blessed. A very different kind of message. Prayer has become for me a kind of realignment where I take my messages that I get from the world and I submit them to a God's eye view. You may hear some thunder in the background. I'm very conscious of it standing on this mountain because one of the most important lessons I learned about prayer was on a mountain just like this. We were at the top. We knew we should probably turn back because the storm clouds were rolling in, but we really wanted to make that summit. So we kept going, and then on the way down, that storm hit. The lightning bolts started striking, and we were with a friend who knew a lot about lightning. In fact, we had an ice axe with us much like this, and the ice axes actually start singing to you when the electricity is firing through the air. They make a wailing noise. Boy, you know you're in trouble then. We were above timberline. There were no trees. We were the biggest people there, and it was like we had a bullseye target painted on us. What do? I asked my friend. He said, well, here's what you do. You should at least separate by 100 feet, and so that if you get killed, then maybe somebody can go for help. And then you should put your feet close together and squat down like this. And then maybe the lightning will just pass right through you. If you put your feet apart, it'll probably fry you on the way down. I'm kind of a control freak. You have to be a freelance writer, really. You have to have your files organized, your computer organized. And I realized as I was on top of that mountain, I am not in control. Whether I live or not has nothing to do with me. I am all alone up here with lightning bolts smashing every couple of seconds right around me. And then it occurred to me that that's actually true all the time. I'm not in control of my life. I could die right now. I have no control except over the present moment. The past is too late to change. The future is really out of my control. And I learned an important truth. There's a verse in Psalm 46, where the psalmist, the poet, is talking about lightning and earthquakes and a world that seems spinning out of control. And he says in the middle of that passage, be still and know that I am God. In the Latin version, that word be still is actually vacate, the same word where we get vacation. In a sense, the psalmist is saying, take a vacation. You're not God. You're not in control of the world. And whatever your problems are, your concerns about your health, about your future, about your finances, about wars, about terrorism, about all of these things, turn them over to God. Be still and know that He is God. You're not in control. God is, and He can handle it. That's a very important lesson I learned. And before I learn too many more lessons, I think I'm going to get out of this storm and get off this mountain before the lightning gets any closer. Well, the weather has definitely improved here. I'm no longer worried about water falling down. I'm sitting over water that's flowing down from the mountains. And actually, that image has become important for me as I think about the direction of prayer. I used to always start with myself, trying to get God involved in my life. As I climbed in the mountains, though, I took that image of water always flowing down and reimagined my prayer life as that image. I've been to the top of mountains where a stream like this starts. You don't see water there, you see a snowfield. You can hear the water melting underneath, and then just at the edge of the snowfield you'll see little trickles of water. They join together and form a little wider stream, form a little alpine pond, then that spills over, makes a larger lake, and then gradually that lake spills over and makes a stream like this. Several of these streams come together and eventually you have a raging river. And if you followed this all the way down, you'd actually end up in a reservoir, a large lake in Denver where you would see sailboats and motorboats and water skiers. I take that image of water from the very top to the very bottom and I go back and rethink my prayer pattern in light of that image. I start at the top now where God is. I talked about the God's eye view that you see from the very top looking down, and what a different perspective on the world you have. When I am with God at the top of the mountain in my prayer, I have to think through who I am, which often needs some correction, some confession. And then I think through who God is, which involves meditation on who God is, His greatness, often thanksgiving and praise for what the gifts that I've gotten from God. And then as that water comes down in the little narrow trickles, I think of the people who are closest to me, my dearest relatives, my neighbors. And as I pray for them, I think of that image of the water flowing down, God's grace flowing down, His blessings into their lives. The stream widens and I widen my own prayer to more national concerns, to more distant relatives, and eventually it ends up in that reservoir. The hardest command about prayer I know of in the Bible is when Jesus said, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. I remember growing up, my enemies were communists. I lived in Atlanta, Georgia, and Russia had missiles pointed right at us, based in Cuba. Later, of course, communism fell, the whole nation changed, and in 1991, I was privileged with a group of Christians to go and meet with the people who were heading up that change in Russia. I met with a colonel in the KGB who stood before us and said, we need to repent for the things that we have done. We need to make good. He went on to become a general and he got 2 million copies of the New Testament in Russian and made sure that every soldier in the Russian army had one. I realized when I was at that meeting that not once had I ever prayed for my enemies as Jesus commanded. We have enemies now in the United States. We have terrorists, we have members of Al-Qaeda. I wonder what it would be like if every church in the United States adopted a member of Al-Qaeda and prayed for him as Jesus commanded us to do. That's an image that has helped me in my own prayers as I think through God's love as an ever-widening stream. How can I be part of that stream? Starting with who God is and expressing that to the people who are closest to me, on even to my enemies. You're in a group, probably, studying this book together. At the end of each session, I'm going to suggest an activity that you can do with your group. I would suggest today that you take that image that has been so important to me, the image of the stream that starts at the top and gets wider and wider and flows down. Take that image and fill in your own words. Pray together and actually express those concerns that are close to you, expanding them outward to the full stream of God's love on this world.